There has been an undeniably obvious agreement among Muslim scholars since the dawn of Islam that homosexuality is a major sin and strictly prohibited in Islamic jurisprudence. To start off, we need to know that straightness is a premium quality of a good Muslim. In the opening chapter of the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Fatiha, verse number 5 reads, "Guide us to the straight path. Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim." A person who accepts Islam is required to be straight in his or her speech, actions, relations, worship, and even sex. And any deviation from this norm of straightness is penalized in Islam. To my knowledge, there has never been any dispute among Muslim scholars to the effect that gratifying sexual desires with members of the same sex is severely forbidden, and that doers of such sins are required to immediately take off and ask Allah for forgiveness and are punishable if they insist. However, proponents of homosexuality suggest that Muslims should change their stance toward homosexuality, and they would argue, number one, some scientific research papers prove that some genes affect your sexual orientation. Number two, the word homosexuality is not mentioned in the Quran. It's only the understanding and interpretation of the Muslim scholars. So why is it prohibited? Number three, the story of punishing the people of Lut, or Sodomites, was not because they practiced homosexuality, but because they raped men and did other catastrophic wrong deeds. Number four, the hadith, or the sayings of Prophet Muhammad that have been narrated in regards to homosexuality have been proved to be weak by the Muslim hadith scholars. To refute these claims, let's start with the first one. Atheists claim that some genes have influence on whether someone is sexually inclined to the same sex. Is it scientifically proved to be true? To answer this question, let's start by stating that there is a clear relationship between homosexuality and atheism. This survey finds that LGBTI adults are less religious than the general public. Roughly half of them say they have no religious affiliation, compared with 20% of the public at large, in USA of course. Let's go back to the question, whether genes have influence on whether someone is inclined to the same sex or not. First, what does this mean? They claim that genes make a person prone to the same-sex behavior. To reply, we say, suppose there are such genes that make a person inclined toward a certain evil act. Do these genes justify the commitment of such an evil act? In other words, suppose there is a person who has a stronger sexual desire than the average person. Is he justified to commit rape? Isn't he rather required to have self-control and combat evil desires? Actually, the secular civilization is so weird. Let me ask them, if you legalize gay marriage on the pretext that you protect personal freedom, why do you then prohibit polygamy if it is agreed upon by all the parties involved? However, let's now scientifically refute the claim that genes have influence on whether someone is sexually inclined to the same sex. The American Psychological Association found out that although much research has examined the possible genetic, hormonal, developmental, social, and cultural influences on sexual orientation, no findings have emerged that permit scientists to conclude that sexual orientation is determined by any particular factor or factors. Moreover, many books on human sexuality describe the research on hormonal imbalances as a factor driving homosexuality as inconclusive. An important book in this regard is My Genes Made Me Do It by Neil Whitehead. In the book, the author refutes the possibility of any relationship between genes and homosexuality, giving lots of evidence. Let's now deal with this claim from the perspective of the natural selection theory. Atheists and Darwinists believe that only traits beneficial for survival and reproduction will be passed from one generation to another. My question is, are those claimed genes that make person sexually inclined to the same sex beneficial for survival and reproduction? Of course no. So, why weren't they eliminated by the natural selection? Now let's discuss the atmosphere in which research on the subject are produced. Is it an atmosphere of free, unbiased, and objective scientific research? The answer is absolutely no. Rather, research on the subject is conducted under legal and political terrorism. Yes, I mean it. To explain, the pro-gayism influential lobby in the West managed to introduce the term LGBTI rights, such as a person who criticizes Zionists is labeled as anti-Semitic. Homophobia is the term used to describe those who oppose homosexuality. To the same effect, the UN urged the protection of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex LGBTI people from discrimination on the International Day Against Homophobia. There is also an important event that can help us better describe the atmosphere in which research on this subject are produced. Robert Spitzer, father of modern psychiatric diagnosis, published a study to answer the question, can some gay men and lesbians change their sexual orientation? The findings were that 200 participants reporting a change from homosexual to heterosexual orientation. However, he was strongly attacked by a different health organization to the extent that he had to apologize for his study in 2012 and say, I owe the gay community an apology. Moreover, many health organizations, such as Pan American Health Organization or PAHO and World Health Organization WHO, attacked all those therapies invented to change sexual orientation, describing them as lacking medical justification and threatening health. Regarding the second and third claims, I would say that the word homosexuality is mentioned in the Quran when Allah talks about the Prophet Lut and his people, Sodomites, that they did the obscenity and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala severely punished them. Some thinkers, however, claim that Allah punished them not because of their practicing homosexuality, but because they raped people to humiliate them, and that Allah punished them for the latter action, humiliating and raping, not for the former one, homosexuality. I myself see this claim as naive, since if this were the case, Allah would have mentioned other actions rather than practicing homosexuality in the Quran. Let's examine only one of 9 occurrences where Allah mentioned the story of Lot's people. Let's contemplate in the story in Surah Al-Shu'ara, verses from 165 to 167.
أتاتون الذكران من العالمين وتذرون ما خلق لكم ربكم من أزواجكم بل أنتم قوم عادون قالوا لئن لم تنته يا لوط لتكونن من المخرجين قال إني لعملكم من القالين رب نجني وأهلي مما يعملون.
It is now crystal clear that they approached men because of their lust and sexual desires, not merely because they just used it as a tool to humiliate and rob men. As for claim number 4, I would say that hadith that are not as authentically narrated are those hadith in regard to the punishment, not those hadith in regard to the practice of homosexuality itself. Muslim scholars in the 4 major madhabs of Islam, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, didn't agree on the same punishment. In other words, they have different understanding of how homosexuals should be punished, but all of them agree that they should be given some kind of punishment. To conclude, this religion is a tolerant religion, and it keeps punishment to the last phase. It gives the sinner chances after chances to stop doing the obscenity and to ask Allah for His forgiveness. Now you can see the difference between Islam and the modern secular civilization. Now, do you think seculars and atheists really advocate freedom of expression and liberty? I'll ask the question to Macron. You support publishing the cartoon insulting Prophet Muhammad as an implementation of the value of freedom of expression. Can you also allow for criticizing homosexuality?
اشترك الآن في القناة وفعل زر الجرس ليصلك كل ما هو جديد.